You won't find in history books that white women went to extreme lengths with black male slaves. What I'm about to tell you might be shocking, but it's true. White women slave owners did some very disturbing things with their slaves, beyond what you might imagine. These actions were mostly driven by lust and desire, and they were often kept secret from their white husbands, brothers, and fathers. White women focused mainly on black male slaves, both young and old, for their sexual gratification. Here are some of the terrible things they did. Voyeurism. Some slave owners forced their black male slaves to perform sexual acts while they watched. This turned the men into mere objects of entertainment, stripping them of their dignity and privacy. The women found a perverse pleasure in watching these acts, which turned private moments into public displays of control. For the enslaved men, it was incredibly humiliating and dehumanizing, leaving them feeling powerless and violated. Sadistic pleasure. In some cases, white women took pleasure in sexually humiliating and degrading their black male slaves. They would deliberately inflict suffering to assert dominance and fulfill their twisted desires. This often involved pushing the slaves to their limits in bed, forcing them to perform without breaks. These acts of humiliation were sometimes done in front of other slaves or household members, adding to the public shame. This public humiliation was meant to strip enslaved men of their dignity and emphasize the absolute control of their mistresses. The methods used varied, but they were always designed to maximize the men's degradation. The mistresses took a twisted satisfaction from watching the men suffer, using their pain to reinforce their own sense of superiority and control. Sexual labor for pleasure. One of the most disturbing aspects of this exploitation was how enslaved men were forced into sexual acts for the pleasure of their white mistresses. This created significant psychological, physical, and social harm for the men. They were often coerced into these acts with no ability to refuse, facing severe consequences if they resisted, such as physical punishment, extra labor, or being sold away from their families. Some mistresses even used emotional manipulation, pretending to care or promising better treatment to coerce compliance. Prostitution. In some cases, enslaved men were forced into prostitution to generate income for their owners. They were made to have sex with others for money, with no say in the matter and under the threat of violence or other punishments. White women slave owners saw these men not only as laborers but also as sources of additional income through these forced sexual services. The profits from forced prostitution went directly to the slave owners, deepening the economic exploitation of the enslaved. This practice dehumanized the men, reducing them to mere objects for sexual use, and was an extension of the broader commodification they faced under slavery. The stigma and trauma associated with forced prostitution added another layer of suffering for the enslaved men. Forced reproductive labor. Another cruel practice was forced reproductive labor, where white women slave owners coerced black male slaves into impregnating enslaved women. This was not just sexual exploitation, but a calculated way to increase the slave population and, consequently, their economic assets. The process was systematic and transactional. Enslaved men were chosen for their physical health and strength, and were used as breeding tools with no say in the matter. These forced unions, often monitored closely, ignored personal relationships or feelings. The offspring were valuable commodities, seen as future laborers who would boost the plantation's productivity. This practice violated the bodily autonomy of both the men and women involved, causing severe psychological trauma and reinforcing the brutal system of slavery. The children born from these unions faced a grim future, destined for a life of oppression. Fetishization of physical traits. White women slave owners often fetishized specific physical traits of black male slaves, such as their musculature and perceived sexual prowess. This fetishization turned them into objects of desire and gratification, rooted in racist stereotypes that portrayed black men as hypersexual and physically superior. This added another layer of exploitation to their already harsh existence. Superior white women often projected their fantasies onto enslaved men, ignoring their humanity and treating them as mere bodies to be used. These men's physical traits were objectified, and their individuality was completely disregarded. They were frequently scrutinized and exploited, forced into sexual acts to satisfy the whims and distorted fantasies of their mistresses. The enslaved men had no control over their own bodies and were at the mercy of their owners' desires at any time. Exploiting vulnerable relationships. In the cruel hierarchy of slavery, some white women manipulated power imbalances to create what seemed like romantic relationships with black male slaves. This manipulation was a calculated form of emotional and sexual abuse disguised as affection. These women might feign genuine interest and care, using their authority to create a facade of intimacy. They would offer moments of kindness or attention, leading the men to believe they were valued or protected. In a world where kindness was rare, these deceitful gestures were easily mistaken for genuine affection. Enslaved men, desperate for any positive human connection, clung to these relationships, hoping for a respite from their harsh realities. However, this hope was cruelly exploited. The white women had no real emotional investment and used the illusion of affection as a means to coerce and abuse. Creating dependency, white women slave owners exploited the basic needs and vulnerabilities of black male slaves to control them and enforce compliance with their sexual desires. This tactic was insidious, using control over essential resources like food, clothing, and rest as tools of manipulation. These women could withhold meals, deny proper clothing, or restrict rest periods, forcing enslaved men to submit to sexual demands to secure their basic necessities. They might promise better treatment, extra rations, or lighter workloads in exchange for sexual favors, or threaten harsh punishments, increased labor, or separation from their families if the men resisted. This created a desperate situation where the men's survival depended on submitting to sexual exploitation, leaving them with no real alternatives. The constant threat of deprivation or punishment took a heavy emotional toll, stripping them of dignity and autonomy. They were reduced to mere tools for their mistress's satisfaction, their needs and desires disregarded. Sexual blackmail. Some white women slave owners used sexual blackmail to control black male slaves. They coerced these men into sexual acts and then threatened to expose them to other household members or the wider community to enforce compliance. The fear of public shame and severe repercussions within the tight-knit slave community added an unbearable layer of psychological torment to the already horrific abuse. Enslaved men, fully aware of the severe consequences of exposure, such as ostracism, harsh punishment, or intensified exploitation, felt forced to comply with their owners' demands. This form of blackmail highlighted the complete lack of autonomy and agency that these men experienced. They faced the agonizing choice of enduring further exploitation or risking disastrous fallout from exposure. The constant fear of being revealed kept them in a state of submission, reinforcing their extreme vulnerability within the brutal system of slavery. As for whether white women slave owners were more sexually attracted to black male slaves or more brutal, the situation was complex. Some might have been driven by sexual attraction and a desire to fulfill fantasies, while others used brutality as a means of asserting dominance and control. The actions of these women were often motivated by a combination of sexual desire and a need to reinforce their power and control over the enslaved men. The extreme and dehumanizing acts committed were fueled by both factors, illustrating the profound cruelty of the system. If you found this video insightful and want to see more content, especially if you're interested in discussions about historical and contemporary issues, please support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell icon. You can also explore more videos on our channel. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.